granddaughter, Casey, will tell you that Marshall wears red and rides around in a fire truck. And Sky wears pink and flies around in the air.
Yes.
Is this right?
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Yeah, you're good.
Am I good so far? And Rocky wears green, and Rubble wears yellow, and she'll even tell you that Tracker wears dark green. Am I right?
Yes.
And that Everest wears teal. Now, some of y'all are looking at me like, what in the world are you talking about? Because you don't know Paw Patrol.
Paw Patrol.
She will also tell you that Zuma wears orange. But Zuma is the only pup of all of them that she also identifies by his color and not just the color he wears. Zuma is a chocolate lab. And Casey will tell you that Zuma is black. Zuma is not a black lab. He's a chocolate lab. And Casey tells you he's black like Peepaw, her grandfather. See, this is how we start confusing kids at a very early age and giving them messages about race. Casey, for the longest time, even now, is confused about black and brown because we confuse them. And we don't tell them why this brown is black, but every other brown is brown. So these are the kinds of messages that we send our children. And I believe that the way forward with race is to talk about it, not to pretend that it doesn't exist. So I've had lots of opportunities with my grandchildren. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But first, I have some caveats. Today, in this session, we're not going to talk about unconscious bias. We're not going to talk about intersectionality. We're not going to talk about white privilege. I will mention white fragility, but just for a split second. We're not here to talk about those very important issues because those conversations often happen in other sorts of sessions where people are already bought in. I want to talk about those opportunities we have in our everyday lives that we avoid when it comes to race. And I want to talk about having some ways that we can have those conversations in our everyday lives. I also know, and I'm going to pretend, I also know that race is not just about skin color, but I'm going to pretend today that it is. I also know that that the race issues in the U.S. are not just black and white, but we're going to sort of talk as if they are. And we're not going to argue about what the meaning of race is. We're not going to have that conversation today, even though there are lots of different meanings of the word. We're going to use the commonly held meaning of race when we talk about race. So, in the 15 years that since I first began talking about diversity and inclusion issues, this is what I found, is that people can talk about those high-minded things, but have a hard time in their everyday lives talking about race. So that's what we're going to do today. My own race talk got personal when I started talking with my white grandchildren. So my wife and I have 10 grandchildren, and 9.5 of them are white. I'm not going to explain that right now. If you want to ask me about it later, we can get into all that. And so I've had lots of opportunity to talk with them and to learn some things about race. 7 of those white grandchildren have lived in my home. 4 of them live in my home now. So we've had lots of these opportunities. Casey is one of them, not Zuma. Well, Zuma does live in my house too. But in fact, we have several Zumas. This was the one I could find for the picture. 4.5 years ago, I had the opportunity to do a TEDx talk just outside Nashville, Tennessee, where I live. It's called What I've Learned from My White Grandchildren, Truths About Race. And in 4.5 years, it now has over 1 million views, which didn't come all at once. The first year, there were 5,000 views. And in the second year, there were 15,000. In the third year, there were 50,000. And in the fourth year, 1 million. And there are reasons for that. Sometimes that's how things go viral. But do y'all remember, that was 2014 when I did that TED Talk. And I thought it was really important to talk about race in those days. You remember 2014? Do you think we're still living in the same racial culture as we were in 2014? So I think the need for these conversations is even greater than it was when I gave that talk. So let's start talking. Damon was 5 years old when he asked his Aunt Kimberly the question, "Lily, am I black or am I white?" So Aunt Lily said to him, a little simplistically, "Well, your mama's white and your daddy's white, so you're white." And Damon wasn't really satisfied with that answer. He said, "Well, when I grow up, I'm going to be black." So Damon wasn't confused by his basic colors. So why would a 5-year-old ask such a strange question? He already knew that it mattered, and at 5 years old, he'd already attached value to race. Here's Damon now. In fact, he's probably doing that right now because I'm missing his basketball tournament right now. But that's him at 15. So Damon and Casey have a cousin named Elliot, and when Elliot was 4, he was obsessed with the human body. And it's not that normal 4-year-old obsession with body parts. This is his obsession. So he could tell you all about the digestive system, the part that the esophagus plays, and the stomach, and the large and small intestines. He could tell you about the respiratory system, the part the lungs play, and the diaphragm, and he would tell you that the brain is the control center for the entire body. And when he was 4, he drew this picture. One day he was sort of lecturing me about the body and told me all those things. And I stopped him mid-lecture and I said, Elliot, I have a question for you. What color is my skin? And without even looking at me, he said black. And then I said, what color is your skin? And he paused. And then he said, gray? Gray. So if we pay attention, we can catch our kids in mid-indoctrination. He had learned that my brown skin is supposed to be called black, but he hadn't yet been schooled in what to call the color of his own skin. And again, no one had told him why this brown is black and why that pinkish color is supposed to be called white. This is how we know that race matters. So in her recent book, Raising White Kids, Jennifer Harvey has some advice for parents who are raising white kids. And she likes to talk about race consciousness. And what she encourages for parents of white kids is that they notice and help their children notice and name race early and often. And this is something that folks who are not white have to do all the time. So she's encouraging white parents to do that as well. Interestingly, 7-year-old Zoe, Casey and Damon's sister, saw Jennifer Harvey's book while I was preparing for this. And she said, Peepaw, some people have funny names for books. She said, this book is called Raising White Kids. I think that's funny. And so I took Dr. Harvey's advice, And I said, so Zoe, do you know why this book was written? And she shrugged her shoulders. And I said, you know, a lot of white folks, I didn't say folks, a lot of white people, I said to her, think of themselves as normal and think of everyone else as different. And I said, now, you don't think that way because you have a black grandfather and we talk about black and white. And you go to a school where there are a lot of brown people and just a few white people. So you know what it's like to be normal and you know what it's like to be different. And your friends at school know what it's like to be normal and know what it's like to be different. But there are some white people who know what it's like to be normal and see everyone else as different. And that's why this book was written. So there she is reading another book, and I hope this video works for y'all because this is just for fun. This is the book she's reading. Can you see that?
White fragility.
Yeah. It came in the mail that day, and she wanted to read it, so I didn't argue with it. So Allie Michael and Eleonora Bartoli did a study of white parents and their white adolescent children, and they interviewed the families both together and separately. So they interviewed parents and kids together, and then they interviewed parents and they interviewed kids. And this is what they found. The parents said they taught their children, do not be racist, do not talk about race, do not use the word black, and do not notice racial differences. So they wanted to teach their children that everyone is the same and that racism is bad. And they defined racism as overt, violent, and for the most part, obsolete. This was 2014. Many people believed that in 2014. But the kids, when they were interviewed, say this is what they were taught. They were taught that everyone is the same, that race is superfluous, and that hard work alone translates into success. That's how people get success. And they also talked about some views that they had learned about certain racial groups. They learned black people are lazy, black people are poor, black neighborhoods are dangerous, and black people are physically stronger than white people. Now, I don't assume that that these racial mixed messages that we send kids only are in white families. So the mixed messages we send transcend our families. So it was year 2000, and my dad had just passed, and we were in Columbus, Ohio to bury him. And my wife had driven up our family van to shuttle folks around she drove up from Nashville to Columbus, Ohio to shuttle folks around. So after this ceremony, we were having a meal at my cousin's apartment. So I'm driving the van. My white wife is sitting in the passenger seat, and in the back is my black mom, my 3 black siblings, and two of my black uncles. And we pull up to the apartment complex for this meal, and there's a car in front of us, and there's an older white couple getting out of the car, and they're taking longer than we liked. And one of the passengers in the car, who I won't name, said, "You see this? They know we're here. White people always do this." And then all the chatter in the van kind of silenced. And this anonymous relative broke the silence, and he said, "Oh, Laura," that's my wife, "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean that." And we laughed, and we laughed, and we still laugh. We laughed because we know he didn't mean that. We know that's not even how he thinks, but sometimes we express racial views for a variety of reasons, even things that we don't believe. Sometimes we do it to bond. And this, did I say who, did I slip out who it was? Okay, this relative was bond, he had moved away from the family. He was here for the ceremony. He was bonding with the family, forgetting my white wife who drove the van all the way up from Nashville, Tennessee to shuttle you around. Too often, when it comes to race or ethnicity or color, we only talk about it we don't talk about it in mixed company, and we don't talk about it in public places. But it still comes up when something is going on in our culture, and O.J. Simpson trial, 9/11, Charlottesville, Charleston, travel bans, border walls, something like that happens, DACA repeal, and we start talking about these things, and sometimes we hear from folks who might even be close to us who express things that we never knew they believed. And we realize that race does matter. And children who have been taught to be colorblind are left blindsided because we don't talk about these things. So let's talk. I want to hear some of your stories. You should have that yellow paper in front of you. And I want to allow you to just turn to someone beside you for a few minutes and answer this question with someone beside you, just briefly. Oh, you have one. Okay. Okay, that shouldn't take long. So here's the second question.
I would agree with that, but I would say mine is probably less.
Those were the easy questions. I want to get, for the first question about talking with people racially similar to you, how many had a higher than 5? Okay, almost everybody. Higher than 7, almost. Higher than 7. Okay. What about the other question, people who are racially different from you? How many had higher than 5? Okay, higher than 7. Okay, that's good to know. So let's go on to the next question, or these questions. Anybody want to try this before you talk to someone else? Anyone want to say anything about your own history with race? Yeah, okay.
The first two I can answer. I think I was brought up to be colorblind.
Uh-huh.
But in preschool, I wanted hair like Wayne's, because Wayne had the most awesome hair ever. Her hair went like this.
Okay.
And my mom told me I couldn't have Wayne's hair because Wayne was black.
Okay. Plus, it was Wayne's hair.
I wanted her to make my hair
Right.
look like Wayne's
Right.
hair. And she told me she couldn't make my hair look like Wayne's hair.
Okay.
She could curl it, do all kinds of things, but it couldn't have Wayne's hair.
Right.
Also blonde way.
Right. Right. Anyone else want? Yeah.
Well, I think sort of answering that third question, when I was in high school, I was really, really close to this black family. And going to the apartment that the two siblings, who were just like a year apart in age, and I was the same age, and their mother lived in, and it was just so different from any other kind of living space. You know, I come from this upper middle class white family, and just going there and seeing that, but also seeing that that didn't detract from the fullness and the wonderful life that they had, and that there was actually benefit in the way that, you know, that they experienced and the way that they expressed their blackness and expressed their own story. Learning to kind of get into that rather than just see it from the outside.
Okay. Yeah,
Yes.
both of you.
Oh, okay.
Go
Well,
ahead.
Okay, well, I know I was raised in the 50s and in San Antonio, South, and in my neighborhood in San Antonio, there was one house that they had a black maid and her daughter who lived in the house. And her daughter was the only one in the neighborhood who was my age. And so, wow, you know, I wanted to play with her. But I was told I couldn't because she was the black daughter of the maid, and it wasn't proper. And that was really my very first introduction to race consciousness. It's like, why can't I play with, she's fun, I like her, but I couldn't. This was the 50s, and I'm not sure if it's changed much since then.
Yeah, so I grew up in El Paso, which is pretty much a majority Hispanic community, and so it was a little different because there were very few white people, at least that I came into contact with, and black people. You know, and it was weird because I was kind of raised with this idea of like minorities can't be racist. But my earliest experience with race was like my dad and I went to Dallas, and all he could talk about was how many black people there were around. You know, so that
And he
was
was
really weird.
impressed. He was impressed with that.
No, he was not impressed. It was basically like, that's why we should stay away from there, you know. But I just remember like that kind of threw me off because there was kind of this idea of like, you know, we're minorities, why are we, you know, doing this kind of stuff? So yeah.
Yeah.
I think my background was unusual. I grew up in Detroit, which although it's now 88% black, was probably 30-40% when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s. I had been much more segregated. I had a mother who was quite scholarly about civil rights, and her bookshelves included books like biography of Malcolm X and various authors, you know, Eldridge Cleaver, and you know, I have had and she was very strong when somebody in the family would say something that had poor racial implications. She would be all over it in a very graceful and feminine way of influencing that. And when I was 12, my father compelled me to work at his store all summer for 2 or 3 summers, and I spent the entire day with another employee who was a 45-year-old black man. So I spent more time with him through 3 summers than with any families or friends. I was with him all day, and I also had a fly-in wall perspective of how he was treated in the garden throughout the day as we were out making deliveries and so forth. So it had a profound impact on me to have had that opportunity to have that unusual exposure.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, I guess I'll just offer that even as a very young person, it's difficult because you're always confronted with the idea of race early on from your parents. You have to be taught for fear and for safety, right? So there's this kind of robbing of your childhood to some degree, to a very small degree depending. And then me individually, with kind of a racially ambiguous look to me, there's also some issues inside of our own race. And so I very early on learned that black people are not a monolith, and we can't kind of talk about them in one fell swoop because there's issues inside of the community as well. When it comes to colorism and things of that nature. So it's incredibly complicated, and I started to navigate all those things as a really young kid and just starting to put it all together as an almost 40-year-old man. And so it's still super complicated. And I do just kind of want to offer one thing. I think words are really important. And so I just want to offer to you, you mentioned racist behavior coming from Hispanic culture. And I always was taught that the word racist is power plus prejudice equals racism, right? So you have the power is the operative word there. It's very important. So you can be bigoted, you can be prejudiced, but it's very difficult to be racist without that power dynamic behind it. And so it's important to be careful calling people of a minority community racist. And I just want to, just offer that to you.
Yeah, and I agree with that. You didn't hear my caveat at the beginning that we're not going to get into the real stuff. I mean, that we're going to talk today about. I call this, talking about race 101. It's the entry level because you're absolutely right. But once we do that in our everyday conversations, once we do that, then a lot of people just, okay, I can't do this. That's why we don't have these conversations. But absolutely right. And I do have those conversations. I read those books. I have those conversations in other settings. But we want to talk basic, just and that's an extremely important issue. Somebody else, one of these questions. Go ahead.
Yeah. So my history with race, I guess, is that I was raised in a small East Texas town. There were not a lot of people other than white people, very small minority of both Latinx and Black people. And it was also a place where both extended family members and neighbors saying the N-word was allowed in those families. And so one of my earliest experiences is that was one of the things my parents did not allow. And so that was a different. And then at some point when we were old enough, my dad talked to us about why we were not allowed to say the N-word, and not just, oh, it's bad, but from his personal experience of learning that it was not appropriate, which was he baled hay as a teenager, and he was in a poor rural environment, and so he was often working with Black guys, and he came from a family that used the N-word liberally, didn't recognize that was problematic. Whether he should have or not, that's its own question. I'll leave, But when he said it, or he got schooled appropriately, and so it was having that conversation. I think that's one of the differences, is that my dad did have a lot of those conversations about race that a lot of people weren't having, even though we were getting that message, everybody's equal, but we were having conversations that went against the, so anyway.
Well, I grew up in a very small rural town in North Dakota, which was, there wasn't a Black person to be seen.
In the whole state.
In the
Right.
state. In the 50s, right. So I never knew a Black person, really. I mean, I went to college in the same state, and there might have been a Black basketball player, maybe, I don't know. But I never knew anybody until I moved to Milwaukee after I graduated from college, and I'm a nurse, and so I worked in a hospital and there's a lot of Black people in Milwaukee, and I was so curious. So I asked him a lot of questions, and we bonded about food and about music, and a couple of the nurses' aides invited me to this bar in a bad part of Milwaukee, although they were very protective of me. And because they said, oh, come and eat chitlins. And I mean, I did, because I didn't really know that it wasn't probably a good idea. So it was a great experience, and they were very hospitable. And the music was fabulous, and I think they just, I don't know what they did. If they did it just for an experiment, or if they were
Being friendly.
but they loved me because I was so curious and I asked so many questions. And I don't know if it was just because I never had that exposure and I was so stupid. I don't know if that's what it was.
Well, it sounds like they honored your curiosity.
Yeah.
But it was a wonderful experience, although I looked around and for the first time in my life, I thought, I am the only white person. And I thought, wow, this must be how Black people feel in a setting where they're the only Black people. Because it was not really comfortable, but they took pity on me. So, yeah.
Anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
Sure. Slightly different perspective. I was very privileged to live in a very mixed, semi-urban setting in Northeast Dallas growing up. I went to Muhammad's third grade birthday party. In school, I sat next to Orula Masahiko exchange students, and on my basketball team, played with Tom and Teddy, mixed team. So there was a bit of more of a comfort maybe in multicultural settings that I internalized and thought existed in multiple places in this world, and found out as we moved it doesn't necessarily. And although we've been searching for it in well-integrated spaces, things like that, particularly schools, it's a challenge in Austin, Texas, for example. But as far as earliest memories, I feel I had many non-white authority figures in my life that had an influence for certain. Second grade teachers and sports teams, hot admins at schools and things like that really set the tone. Yeah. And that's a diminishing feature that a lot of white children experience in growing up. Is most authority figures are also white. So.
Okay. Anyone else with these questions? Yeah.
I had a similar experience. I went to elementary school here, and now I'm in high school. But I grew up in a really multicultural elementary school that was like well balanced in terms of like race. And then I went to magnet school for middle school, and I'm in magnet school in high school right now, and it's so different. So it's very separated.
Thanks. Anyone else?
I kind of want to add a thing.
Okay, go ahead.
So I moved then, and then I didn't have class with a single black person again until I was a sophomore in high school.
Okay.
And then there was a girl in my class, and I knew she wasn't as white as me, but I had no idea what her race was. And like a year or so after that, I just didn't talk about it. Something came up, and I was like required, like I needed to state her race for some reason. I don't know why. And I didn't know what she was, and I just kind of shrugged and froze. And she was like, "You don't know that I'm black?" No, I don't know what you are. Like, I didn't know. I had no idea. Like, I think she was just lighter skinned or maybe mixed, but like, and that was the end of the conversation. Like, just like the outrage at me not knowing her race and me totally not knowing her race.
Yeah, and you know, mixed. When we use that word mixed, that's fairly recent, because she was black. If she may have been mixed, but she was black.
Yeah.
So we use, our language changes. Anybody want to tell us, some of you have already done this, but anyone else want to tell us anything about your family's racial history?
Yeah, I want to talk about my grandparents, specifically my grandfather. My mom, she told me that she heard the story from my dad. My dad's Hispanic, by the way. I'm not half Hispanic. And he said it was a story about my grandfather when he was 10 years old. He was out late one day, and he was, I guess he was somewhere in Vidor, which is Vidor is kind of like a little bit. Yeah, so you know.
You don't want to be
yes,
there.
exactly. And he's Hispanic. Yeah, but yeah, still.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, but you know.
Explain to us.
So, you know, Vidor is like, I don't know if the KKK is still there, but they have members there. And so anyway, my grandfather being 10 years old, he got his teeth knocked out. So ever since then, he didn't want, he prohibited Spanish being spoken in the household. So this going down, I don't know Spanish, and I don't know part of my history because of that.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I mean, this is my mother. So my mother grew up in the Midwest in the 1950s and 60s, as did my father in Wisconsin. And then they moved here just a few years before I was born. I moved to Dallas. And so I grew up not having parents and grandparents who just had no, they didn't have a history with race, because they didn't know any people of different races until my parents both are in the medical field and started working. But so then when I started to realize that, and living in Dallas, so many of my friends, their families go back in Dallas generations. And so their grandparents are white people who are so racist. And I was like, oh, well, you know, my family's not like that. But then I was like, oh no, my grandmother, who even though she, you know, just, it's out of ignorance in her case, she's never met a black person, she still says some things that are problematic. But, you know, that idea that it traces back so far, and, you know, that these people, their great-great-grandparents or great-great-great-grandparents owned slaves or were slaves, depending, you know, I can't relate to that. My family wasn't here, and when they got here, they moved to the Midwest, but that idea was surprising.
Anyone else?
My grandmother is 95, and I just recently got to hear about this from her, but she was a teacher in Clarksdale, Mississippi, which is the Delta, Mississippi. And she talks about how Clarksdale was like one of the top educational, had one of the best educational programs in the state of Mississippi up until segregation was in schools. And the story that she tells is how there were 8 teachers at her public school that she worked at, and she was a first grade teacher. And they required, when segregation ended, 2 teachers from her school to go work at what was the black school. And she talks about how, like, the way she says is that God told her that this is what she should do. She should be one of these 2. The struggle for me and the paradox of the story is that, so that happened in the middle of the year. So after the Christmas break, she moved to the school. And she says that she spent the next semester going to this school every day and coming home just crying. And just like weeping every day. And my mother said that she watched this happen. And at the end of that semester, she ended up deciding to stop working at school and going and working at a private school, because all these private schools sprung up for the white kids to go to. And so there is like, it's incredible to hear that story, and that she felt this calling to go do this in a sense, but at the same time she couldn't handle it. And so I have this mixed kind of feeling about hearing that and hearing this. It sounds like, you know, something that she felt strongly about doing, but at the same time stepped away from it, withdrew from that experience, and decided that she couldn't handle being in that world.
I was going to say, so I know that part of my family came over from Ireland, Mexico, and when that particular ancestor got to Mexico, I know he really tried to fit in, right? So he changed his name completely to make it sound, to make it Spanish essentially. And, so there was always kind of like this wanting to incorporate into the larger culture. And then the other side of my family is indigenous Mexican. So it's strange because that one is kind of moving away from like this Hispanic identity in order to maintain like an indigenous identity, right? Wow. So there's 2 very different competing sides of that, because one's kind of moving towards and the other one is moving against. So there's always kind of been that tension within my family as well. So.
I like that you mentioned the word tension, because I think my family, I'm actually going to talk a little bit, I'm presenting in here in a couple hours.
Okay.
I'm actually going to talk a little bit about my story, but I don't know that I could really talk about a racial history, except that I experience a racial present, in that my brother, who's 3.5 years younger than I, is a quarter Japanese. He's adopted, as am I. Our parents are white. I am white. My brother is a quarter Japanese, and so for the last 35 years, 36 years. I grew up experiencing all these kinds of microaggressions, right? Your friend saying, that's your brother. And how's he your brother? How does that work? Or how does he fit? I am now the mother of a 6-year-old brown son. And I get, it's odd, I find myself, battling my in-laws, who are from very small town, northwest Iowa. We're from Iowa, by the way.
And by the way, I was sorry about Steve King.
You have to say that every day.
I say that every day because my in-laws have a Vote for Steve King banner on the front of their property. And their grandson is, we lovingly refer to him as the Guatemexican. He's Guatemalan and Mexican. And so it's interesting. I don't know very much. Maybe we didn't talk about it, but we talk about it now because it impacts us now. One of your first questions was, sort of how do you perceive sort of that racial climate changing? And I guess for me, my experience, right, is that I think we all kind of nodded that it's gotten worse. I don't see that anything has changed. So that it's maybe not my family's racial history, but sort of the racial history that I personally have experienced. Just been,
I'm curious whether anyone else that is perceived as white feels more comfortable, felt a higher number in speaking about race with people of other races than with white people.
Good question.
As myself.
And I actually want to say, because for me, it depends on, for me, it's like which white people am I talking to, and which people of color am I talking to? But generally, I feel more comfortable speaking to people of color about race, regardless. But when it comes to white people, it's like, if I'm in a group like this, I'm completely comfortable. If I'm at home with family at Thanksgiving, it's more difficult. I do it, but it's a lot more difficult. So there's a lot of that, or if I'm in a very conservative space, it's very different, but it's definitely easier. But I'm in an academic setting where I'm doing this virtually all the time, it seems like, so.
I think it's funny that you asked that because I had difficulty with that same question. This is my partner in crime over here, and I said to her, I said, it's not, the word that threw me, semantics, was discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Because I find myself perfectly comfortable in a posture of listening to my friends who are people of color and their experience. But I always sort of feel like that is not the conversation where I get to take space. So I wondered that very question too, and also about.
Really good question.
Yeah, I can enter the conversation, but I'm willing for the black people to be the experts because they out of matter of survival need to know more than white people do.
Okay, it's a really good question. You did break the rules because I asked the questions, but I'm going to let you go.
If I may.
Yeah.
Well, I maybe the only person in here whose grandparents were raised on Louisiana plantations, and with the total plantation attitude toward blacks. And I was raised with them calling them Negras. It was okay to say Negra, okay, and was the way that they talked about them. And they didn't, it was very unself-conscious, and they had a black maid. They always had a black maid. She always lived over on the other side of town. They lived in a little town in West Texas. And she had a little ramshackle house, and they'd give her, but she was part of the family. I mean, really and truly, they loved her like family. But yet she lived in a little ramshackle house over on the black side of town, and they didn't even own a car or anything. And they didn't see they never were able to see the injustice of that. But mainly it was something that I was raised with, just at their house, not at my house, of course, in San Antonio. But it made I didn't really get to know any blacks until I got to college, because I was raised in a very white part of San Antonio. There weren't that many blacks in San Antonio at the time either. But anyway, I just think it was just adding to the conversation as someone whose grandparents, who actually were still in a slave owning mentality, you know, when being raised that was very different.
Okay. Let's move on to two more questions, and we're going to have to be brief with these. So I want to, because we've been talking about a little bit about conversation, who can tell us about some positive conversation you've had about race? Positive conversation you've had about race.
I had one here.
Okay.
There were chocolates being sold, and it said Ashkenazi on the brand of the chocolate, actually someone's last name. And I was conversing with him. Well, I'm 99.9%, according to 23andMe, Ashkenazi Jew. And there was a lady who overheard and said, well, I'm 33% Sephardic. And so now we're friends, Susan. That's great, that's great. Came from Candy.
Someone else?
When I went to college in a small town in Ohio, at my college orientation, I was out to dinner, and it was me and a bunch of other white people, and then this one Mexican guy who became one of my best friends. We both were coming from Texas to Ohio, and you're sitting there, and I made some joke about that going to public school in Dallas. I know a lot of Mexicans, so I made some well, Mexicans don't eat fried chicken or whatever, and he was like, no, we don't, and we both just laughed, and everyone else was like, wait, what? And then, but slowly, those people, because they've never been exposed to Hispanic or Latinx people, were like, oh, okay, there's some familiarity here, and because of where you come from, there's some knowledge.
Yeah. The relationship really matters.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, y'all had said that earlier with, depends on which white people you're having conversation with or which people of color you're having conversation with. So relationship matters. Anyone else want to talk about positive race conversation?
I had one yesterday, and the reason I missed here from 10 to 6 yesterday at the school I work at, we had an equity and inclusion conference, so it wasn't strictly about race, but it was significantly about race. And just, I think it was 204 people signed up, they said, mostly students from a bunch of schools around the state, but a lot of the adults did. Really positive.
Thank you. So I want to end with asking a favor of you all. I want you to get that little green card out and fill out the front of it. And then on the back of it, if you would answer for me this question. And so while you're doing that, I just want to say thank you all for participating. I appreciate it.